I wanted to go back to the 1950s when there was a consensus among politics, when Republicans and Democrats were pretty close together, when there was a middle class, when people agreed on things. I wanted to read a quote that you have, a marvelous quote that I had heard before, but a quote from Eisenhower in a letter that he sent to his brother, and here it is. Should any political party attempt to abolish Social Security, unemployment insurance, and eliminate labor laws and farm programs, you would not hear of that party again in our political history. There's a tiny splinter group, of course, that believes you can do these things. Among them are H.L. Hunt. You possibly know his background, a few other Texas oil millionaires, and an occasional politician or businessman from other areas. Their number is negligible, and they are stupid. That's the President of the United States. I think that was 1954.
It's the Republican President of the United States.
Republican President. Now, how did that all change around in 20 years?
It's actually a bit more than 20 years, but okay, so here's what happened. It's really two things happened. One is that a movement, a hardline, basically radical movement took over the Republican Party. So, yes, Virginia, there is a vast right-wing conspiracy. It's not it's perfectly open. There's a whole set of overlapping institutions that, in effect, enforce a right-wing orthodoxy. Everything from the Heritage Foundation to Fox News. They are cohesive. There's an ideological common thread, and if you look at the funding sources, although there are many, many different institutions, they all have the same set of donors. You go and look underneath and you find Richard Mellon Scaife and Coors and Koch and Smith Richardson and Bradley providing crucial funds for institution after institution. Actually, I've always thought that the sort of crazy demonization of George Soros on the right, it's partly, they're just looking for a villain, it's partly a little bit of anti-Semitism, but it's partly that the idea that an evil billionaire is coordinating everything. Well, that is the way things work in their world. So, so this where it really has a tremendous effect. It has pushed the Republican Party far to the right of where public opinion is. There are, the public has never really bought into the idea that, certainly the public has never bought into the idea that Social Security ought to be dismantled. But this is a sort of fundamental plank. And it's been able to win elections. That's the crucial thing. Although people have never bought into the ideology, this right-wing movement. I call it movement conservatism in the book, which is not my term. That's what they themselves call it. If you Google movement conservative, you'll find a bunch of conservatives talking about being movement conservatives. The ability to win elections has been crucial, and the ability to win elections has come from the exploitation of other issues, not economics, but other issues. And so that's the big story of the book. I don't know how far we want to, but so those issues, other issues, have included, of course, national security, moral values, religion. The 2004 election was, Bush won by being the defender of the nation against gay married terrorists, but but above all, race. The core of the story of what happened to America is the long turn that began after the Civil Rights Movement, the great exploitation of the race issue, which is what pushed American politics to the right.
I mean, there's that famous quote from Lyndon Johnson, who talked to Bill Moyers, and said after the Civil Rights Act, I think I've shifted the South to the Republican Party for the next generation.
He said, I've given the South to the Republicans for my lifetime and yours, to a very young Bill Moyers. And so far that appears to be about right. And by the way, one of the, I'm a data hound, right? I love numbers and these things. And because I try not to put too many in the book, but we all know that white men have left the Democratic Party, and they've left it because it's weak on national security and it doesn't like guns, and it's the nanny state, and a whole list of reasons. None of which is true, because the fact is that outside the South, white men have not left the Democratic Party. In 1952. 40% of non-Southern white men voted Democratic. In 2004, 39% of non-Southern white men voted Democratic. All that happened was that Southern whites switched parties. It's amazing how, once you take into account the great Southern, the fact that Southern whites started voting Republican after the Civil Rights Movement, there's not much left to explain. And that has been the basis of the political strategy. Now, Richard Nixon had the Southern strategy, based on basically exploiting the backlash against civil rights, and that has been throughout. I mean, I want to launch into my explanation of who Ronald Reagan really was, but we can talk about that if you did.
Well, well, feel free.
Yeah,
I wanted to just say that things changed so quickly, and you know, in 1980, when Ronald Reagan took office, you know, as you say in the book, the rich were no richer relative to the average American than they had been in the Eisenhower years, and just a few years before that, still 27% of the labor force were unions, and how quickly things change, and there are people of my generation, you know, who talk about how, you know, the left has to continue, or liberals have to continue to win, they have to continue to win, but the conservatives only have to win one time. That is, if you want to nationalize an industry, you know, you can do that only under great political revolutionary times, or great upheaval, or something that an external event. But once you privatize it, you can privatize a national industry almost overnight, and then reclaiming it becomes extremely difficult. You can drop a 91% tax rate down to 50 and 30 and 20%, but to raise it back to 91%, nobody would even conceive as possible. So you talk about raising it by 5% or 7%. So how do you?
I'm not sure that's
optimistic in that sense.
I think if you can create programs, the lesson in history, I think, is that if you create great middle-class programs, things that make people's lives more secure, then they become very, very hard to undo. I mean, and like I said, I'm feeling so optimistic that my friends think I might be having problems. But the beginning of my optimism really came in the spring of 2005, when we had the great fight over Social Security. And, you know, this was, Bush said he had his mandate, and if you went to the conventional wisdom of politics, inside the Beltway, it was all, oh, you know, of course he's going to succeed in privatizing, it's basically going to unravel the system. And I'd like to say, well, you know, those of us who doggedly shot down the arguments one after another wanted, but what really happened was the American public basically said, hey, we really like this program. There just was no appetite in the country for the right-wing agenda on this. In fact, even the red states were as hostile to the idea of privatizing Social Security as blue states. It just if we had Medicare. Medicare was deeply controversial when it was being proposed. Ronald Reagan made a recording for the American Medical Association that was supposed to be played. It was actually called Operation Coffee Cup. Was to be played at coffee clutches by doctors' wives to convince people of the evils of socialized medicine, meaning Medicare. And now Medicare is very, very difficult. Newt Gingrich tried to gut it and didn't succeed. And of course, part of the problem is having people understand what it means. As I do mention the famous the constituent who yelled at her senator, Senator, don't let the government get its hands on Medicare. But it's a very real, you know, this is, if we can get this one reasons, again, I know I'm jumping forward, but if we had universal health care, and I think there's reasonable odds that we will in not too distant future, it will become untouchable. It'll become something that every American views this as her birthright, as they should.